Greetings ladies and gentlefish, and welcome back to another tank review, this time looking at the M4 Sherman Tier 5 American medium tank. I'd like to say right off the bat that whilst I'm looking at the American Sherman, there is also a Tier 5 Sherman in the British tech tree at Tier 5, the Sherman 3, and some minor differences aside, the two tanks are incredibly similar, so I'm very unlikely to do a separate review for the Sherman 3, so if you want, consider this a little bit of a review of the Sherman 3 as well, as whilst there are some minor differences, overall the two tanks are basically the same. A little bit of history for you then. So of course this is the famous M4 Sherman. Wasn't originally called the Sherman, it was just the M4 medium tank, or medium tank M4. Got called the Sherman by the British later on. It was essentially a development of the M3 Lee or M3 Grant that came before it. So they removed the 75mm gun from the hull mounting, and they took the gun and whacked it in a turret and shoved a turret on top, and that is essentially the M4 Sherman. At the time, and bearing in mind we're talking early war here, at the time, the armour was enough to shrug off most German anti-tank guns that were, well, at least mounted on a tank, pointed at it, bearing in mind, at this stage in the war, we're talking about things like the Panzer II and the Panzer III. These are not particularly well-gunned machines. And it had the 75mm gun on it was perfectly capable of killing those tanks in return. And also the 75mm gun, because it was the same gun from the M3 Lee, but because it didn't have a particularly long barrel, it didn't have a particularly high shell velocity, which actually means, I'm not going to get into the reasons, but it actually means that the tank packed a pretty decent high explosive shell. And that's actually one of the reasons that the British had quite liked the M3 Lee. The gun had given them a much better high explosive shell than they got with their 6-pounder guns. And of course the high explosive shell from the 2-pounder, I mean, no one ever bothered using it because it was terrible. So this tank, when it was conceived, outclassed anything really the Germans were going to throw at it. Now, of course, that wasn't the case throughout the war, but at the time it was true. And after initial combat experience, the Americans didn't feel any particular need to invest in developing this tank further. They thought the Sherman would win the war. It was only really when the tank came across things like the upgunned Panzer IV, with that longer 75mm gun, and subsequently the Tiger and Panther tanks, that the problems of the tank really started to show. Now, to be fair to the Americans, they did address this. They did later on in the war upgun this tank to have a 76mm gun that could go through the frontal plate of the Tiger from some reasonable combat ranges, and the British of course famously developed the Sherman Firefly, which once again packed a 76mm gun perfectly capable of killing a Tiger or a Panther from decent range. But a lot of the tanks in service with the Western Allies were still the basic Sherman, and this thing was an incredibly numerous tank. It was for the Western Allies as the T-34 was for the Soviet Union, and the Panzer IV was for the Germans, produced in very large numbers, and used throughout the war. Now, this thing was really designed and conceived with an emphasis on reliability, because obviously when you're out in the field you don't have a mechanic on hand to come and spend 6 hours repairing your tank all the time. So the M4 Sherman was designed overall to be a rugged, reliable machine, and throughout the war it ended up being that. Always remember, although sometimes the Sherman gets a little bit of a bad rep for still packing a low velocity 75mm gun in 1945, do remember that most of the time tanks didn't fight other tanks. They fought infantry, or they fought soft targets like anti-tank emplacements or machine gun nests, or they were clearing out buildings in an urban environment. And in that sort of situation, the superior high explosive shell that the Sherman got with the original 75mm gun was preferable. So in most situations, what we would consider the stock Sherman was arguably the most effective Sherman variant. You could then get into the argument about whether the armour was up to snuff or not, of course. But again, most of the time, unless the Germans were firing a 75mm anti-tank gun or larger at it, the armour did the job, you know, against small arms fire, 50mm guns, and things like that. And actually, when I started playing World of Tanks, a lot of people get into the game and they have visions of driving the mighty Tiger and all this, but for me it was the Sherman. That was the tank I wanted to get onto, and subsequently the Pershing and the Centurions. Anyway, what do we actually get in game? Well, we're here at Tier 5. So Tier 5 is often where people consider the game kind of really starts coming into its own. Tiers 1 to 4 are much more, I guess you could call them training tiers, I suppose. But what is it that we actually get? Well, I'm going to come back to the gun a little bit later, but just now to note that you get 12 degrees of gun depression, which is really, really, really nice to have on a Tier 5 tank. In terms of survivability, 460 hit points is par for the course for a Tier 5 medium tank. Often they pack around about 450. Some of the premiums come with more, like 600, but usually they come with a fairly significant downside to offset that, so they need those additional hit points, but 460 is fine. We'll talk more about the armour in a bit. Suffice to say for now, the armour can bounce the odd shot here or there, especially if you're facing lower tier tanks. But you are not going to be relying on it to bounce everything pointed at you. And now, of course, with changes to the matchmaker a little while ago, Tier 5s no longer face Tier 3 tanks, which I think is probably a good thing, but from the perspective of the Sherman, not so much, because it quite enjoyed derping Tier 3s in the face and one-shotting them. Mobility, well, it's a 31-odd ton tank with a 460 horsepower engine when fully upgraded. Specific power of around about 15 horsepower per ton, which is alright. It gets the job done, but nothing spectacular. And while the top speed is 48 kilometers an hour, and you can get up to that, you're not going to be travelling at that speed most of the time. Reverse speed of 18 kilometers an hour is fine, nothing to really get excited about, and ditto for the traverse speeds. Concealment, we're not really going to get into this too much. Just remember, the Sherman is quite a tall tank, so it's not going to be the best camouflaged machine in the world. Spotting. Now, this thing gets a pretty decent radio, 650 meter signal range. I know that doesn't really excite people, but worth noting anyway. And a view range of 370 meters. Now, this is actually pretty good at Tier 5. A number of Tier 5 medium tanks come with about 350 meter view range, so 370 is definitely a strength of the tank. Let's have a quick look at the modules and the grind on this thing though, and see how painful that is. So you're coming at the M4 Sherman over here. There's only one way to get to it. You go from the T1 Cunningham through the T2 M2 mediums, and then into the M3 Lee and up to the M4 Sherman. Personally, I don't keep any of these low tier tanks. The M3 Lee is a bit of an acquired taste. It can be very powerful with a punchy gun, but a lot of people just find it kind of meh. The M2 medium gets a 75mm derp gun. Again, that can be quite good fun, but it wasn't really for me. And the T2 medium, it's a tier 2. Most people, and there are much more powerful tier 2s in the game. When you get to the M4 Sherman, however, what sort of grind are you faced with? Well, this is kind of a bad news, not so good news situation, if we're going to be honest. So your stock gun is the same 75mm M3 gun that you could use on the M3 Lee at Tier 4. On the M3 Lee at Tier 4, it's a reasonable gun. You have a high rate of fire for good DPM. The accuracy isn't very good, but that's not the end of the world. Here at Tier 5, it is not something you want to be using longer than you strictly speaking have to. And what you actually notice when you go from the M3 Lee at Tier 4 to the M4 Sherman at Tier 5, this gun actually takes a nerf. Your aim time remains the same, but your accuracy is a god-awful 0.46, your rate of fire goes down. Basically, you don't want to use this gun if you can possibly avoid it. Unfortunately, none of the other guns available on the tank will have been already unlocked on previous tanks in this line. The only way you'll have either the howitzer or the M1A1 76mm gun unlocked are if you have played other American tank lines, which is kind of annoying. But there we go. It's a similar story for the engines, I'm afraid. The top engine here, the M4 Sherman, is the first time in the line you come across it. Even the mid-engine here, the M4 Sherman, is the first time in the line you come across it. So you're stuck playing with the stock 350 horsepower engine, which isn't completely terrible, but given that the mobility on this thing is mediocre with the 460 horsepower top engine, it's not particularly good. What I'm getting at is that the stock grind on the Sherman is a stock grind. You're not going to have anything already unlocked. So, what would I prioritise? Well, I'm going to have to say in the first instance, please get a better gun, because the stock gun is terrible. The 105mm howitzer is a perfectly usable gun, and in fact it's the gun that I still have equipped on my Sherman. So my priority would be getting this gun, assuming that it fits on the stock tracks, which off the top of my head I honestly cannot remember. It looks like possibly not. Certainly in its elated configuration, the stock suspension is not sufficient. So you are going to want to get this gun, but realistically to mount it, probably going to want to get the tracks. So these two are going to be the first two items on your wish list, the 105mm howitzer and the upgraded suspension. Once you've got the upgraded suspension, I would focus on the engines. Once you've got the gun and the engine, focus on the engines. You can come back for the turret and the top gun later. Focus on these engines. Increase your mobility as best as you can. The stock radio is not very good, but then again, no one really gets excited about radios, so leave that until the end of your grind. In the case of the top gun, the M1A1, well, you have to go through the top turret to get to it anyway. You do want this turret, although on paper it looks like your frontal armor on the turret actually goes down. Bear in mind your side and rear armor on the turret go up, and it has a worse traverse speed, something else worth bearing in mind, but you do get a gun mantlet shoved on the top, so effectively your frontal armor is better and your view range is significantly better. You do want it. You do want this turret. In terms of the top gun, well, let's talk about these guns. The stock gun is terrible, but which of the other two guns you choose to use is going to come down to a matter of preference. You've got the conventional 76mm anti-tank gun, 12.5 rounds a minute rate of fire, which isn't fantastic, 128 average penetration, which for a tier 5 medium tank is very good. In fact, off the top of my head, I think it's best in class. 115 average damage, again, good. 0.43 dispersion, not good. This gun is not very accurate, and this is the reason I don't like this gun on the M4 Sherman. It is kinda derpy, and for a gun that's quite so derpy as it is, when it hits, it doesn't hit that hard. I mean, 115 average damage is nice, but it's not world-ending. So for me, I don't like this gun. If you don't like that gun, then you're using the 105mm derp gun, which is my gun of choice. 6.67 rounds a minute rate of fire, but this gun is not about the DPM. 53 penetration and 410 alpha damage with HE rounds. That 53 penetration is sometimes enough to penetrate same tier medium tanks. That's without premium ammunition, and 410 alpha damage is going to leave them hurting. 0.55 dispersion at 100 meters is god awful. But you just get close, derp them, and then roll back. 2.5 second aim time is also not very good, but it's not bad enough to completely hate it. If you want to fire premium ammunition, of course, the alpha damage goes down to 350, the penetration goes up to 101. Honestly, that penetration isn't fantastic. You can see it's worse than the standard penetration on the 76mm gun. And whilst I carry a couple of heat rounds, I'm not sure if I've ever actually fired one out of this gun. So, bear that in mind. Now, you could be looking at this and going, well, you know what, I want to get the Jumbo rather than the Easy 8, so I'm not even going to bother unlocking this M1A1 gun. Don't think like that, because when you get to the Jumbo, you have to unlock this gun anyway. And you might as well do it a tier lower, so it's one less thing you have to grind, with a worse gun a tier higher. So do unlock this 76mm gun, even if you never have any intention of using it. Similar story for the Sherman Easy 8. In terms of crew skills and equipment, sorry, let's just quickly go back to the gun. So when you see the replays, you're going to see me playing with the 105mm derp gun, because I don't like the 76mm. There are replays on YouTube using the 76mm if you want to go and check those out. In fact, I've even put one up on my channel using that gun, and if I think of it and if I've got the time, I might go back and link that replay in the description so you can see what that gun is like. But bear in mind that I'm not using it, I'm using the derp gun, so, you know, have that in mind. Anyway, equipment, crew skills, consumables, and all of that jazz. I've just got your standard 3 consumables. This thing does set on fire sometimes. The rear is essentially engine and fuel tank. You can also get ammo racks, so you definitely want your repair kit. The ammo racks are below the turret on either side of the hull, so that is something worth bearing in mind. Equipment, well, this is where things get a little bit funky. So, historically, the M4 Sherman did mount a gun stabilization system. It wasn't amazing, but it did keep the gun on target when on the move and just after moving better than if you didn't have it. But here in World of Tanks, it can't actually take a vertical stabilizer, which is kind of irritating, and I assume it's a balancing mechanic. So despite the fact that that's what it historically had, you can't actually mount the damn thing. So what are you going to take? Well, okay. Medium caliber tank gun rammer is always a decent choice. Better DPM is better DPM, so I do recommend that. I would also... Well, this is when you're going to start getting into your own preference. Personally, because I was using the derp gun, I then went enhanced gun laying drive to make the aim time a little bit better, and I went vents just for all-round improvement of the tank. Other equipment you could take, binos to bump up the view range, although the base view range on this tank is good enough that you could also use optics. If you're going to do this, I would probably couple it with vents just for the added boost to your view range. Squeeze as much out of it as you can and probably have a decent crew. But that's up to you. So I would say if you're using the 76mm gun, you probably want to run something like rammer, optics, and then either vents or an enhanced gun laying drive. If you're using the derp gun like I did, well, I would recommend going rammer, vents, and gun laying drive, and just say screw the view range, I'm just going to dirt people in the face at point blank range. Ammo, you can see here I've got 6 rounds of heat ammunition, although I don't think I ever fired them. Crew skills, nothing hugely surprising here. I don't have my M4 Sherman crew anymore just to show you them, because they weren't dedicated to this tank, they've just been doing the rounds. 6th sense on your commander, safe stowage on your loader. The ammo rack can be a problem, so you do want safe stowage. Repairs on everyone else, and then when you've got that, there's all the standard good stuff, brothers in arms, smooth ride, snapshot, all of those bits and bobs for you to play with. So, with all that said and done, I'm going to stop waffling. I'm going to quickly show you the armor profile on this tank, just to give you an idea what it's like, and then we're going to go and derp some people in the face. Okay then, let's look at the armor profile. So the armor from the rear is pretty terrible on the hull, although interesting to note that the turret is essentially close to the same all around. You've got this 63.5mm of armor at the rear, at the sides, and also at the front. So the turret is relatively hard to crack. So if you get shots at the rear of the tank, just don't aim at the turret. Front of the tank is nothing too impressive. It's 51mm of armor with some angling to give you effective of around about 70-75. The machine gun port is strictly speaking a weak spot. There we go, just here. Although most of the time you won't really have to bother aiming for that, because overall the armor on this tank is not fantastic. Front of the turret, as I mentioned, is 63.5, but with some angling you can get some higher values. There is a commander's hatch you can hit as well back here. Just above the gun mantlet you have got 45.5mm of armor, but angled back at about 63 degrees to give 99 effective armor, so you can penetrate it there. The gun mantlet, regions that are about 90 effective, regions that are a bit thicker. Nothing too impressive though. If you're using all of the tank's gun depression, the story does become slightly better. This upper front plate goes up to around about 90mm. The turret is still basically the same, except that you can't hit these regions above the gun mantlet. So where possible, use that awesome gun depression and go hull down. And just bear in mind that the armor on the Sherman is not fantastic, and whilst you can bounce some lower tiers here or there, you shouldn't expect to be bouncing things that are pointed at you. If you do, it's nice, but don't rely on it too much. As normal then, we are going to have a top tier game and a bottom tiered game to give you an idea of what you are going to experience with this tank. And once again, just to reiterate, I am using the 105mm howitzer on this thing. Now, this is our Tier 5 match. Remember, of course, Tier 5 tanks no longer see Tier 3 tanks. Technically, I believe they can see Tier 4s, but in my experience, when you are driving around in your Tier 5 tanks now, an all Tier 5 match is often about as close as you get to being top tier. People don't tend to keep many Tier 4s, with the possible exception of a couple of tank destroyers. Generally speaking, they push on to Tier 5, where, yeah, the tanks are kind of maybe a little bit better. Anyway, here on Ensk, Ensk is of course a pretty small map, which means the engagements tend to happen pretty quickly, and this is one disadvantage, not that he noticed, one disadvantage of the howitzer is of course you're firing high explosive and high explosive anti-tank ammunition, which doesn't knock stuff over, so if you've got destructible terrain in your way, that can block your shot. However, one sometimes advantage is that the shell has quite a high shell arc, so you can see there it looped down onto that leopard and really wrecked his day. Although of course it's a howitzer, the shell velocity is pretty naff. Can we finish off that leopard? Nah, he's not having any of it. Fair enough. Can't really say I blame him. We did manage to shave off 216 of his health, and that wasn't a penetrating shot, that was just a non-penetrating HE shell. And we still took off a large chunk of his face. Remember, this is only Tier 5. Light tanks only have about 350 health, medium tanks about 450, heavy tanks about 600, you know. So, 200 damage per shot is quite a lot. 126 into that T-34. You can see here we're not really bothering to aim that much at this sort of range. We're just derping them in the face, and if it works, great, and if it doesn't, well, screw it, we're going to reload soon enough anyway. This is of course a Tier 5 game, or a Tier 5 machine, which means that it can be pretty darn profitable. Goodbye, Mr. T-67, you have been rebalanced. Thought you were overpowered, did you? Knock that Gubbins out the way and let's see if we can do something about that Stug. No, he doesn't like them dice, can't really say I blame him. KV-1S doesn't appear to be looking this way, let's do something about that. Only 99 damage, but we didn't even bother aiming, so who cares? And they are repeatedly giving us time to reload. M7 light tank now, well that's going to be an easy execution for 62 damage. And we're on 2 kills. Scoreline is 7-3. Battles on Ensk tend not to take too long in my experience. There is a VK3001 kinda behind us, the other side of some train tracks. We want to be a little careful about him. And there is of course that Stug. 160. A couple of critical hits as well. That's the other thing with these HE shells of course. Oh, there goes my ammo rack. That was bad. Don't really want that to happen again, so we repair it. HE, of course, does do quite a lot of critical module damage. Hello, Mr. VK. 90 into you. Some more critical hits. But you can see there we lost our ammo rack to a shot in the rear. So, and that premium from a Churchill 3 in this matchmaking? Really? Are you sure? I guess the guy doesn't want to engage his brain even in the slightest. Oh well. Doesn't look like he's going to win for it, which will be nice, so, go figure. Stug is still on 190 health. Can we do any more damage to him, possibly finish him off? Which way is he looking? We can take a shot from him if we need to. As it is, that's his bum and we don't need to. And, someone else lands a shot first. So we get the kill, but only with 79 damage. Going back then, Churchill 3 over there and the Lefebvre, the Leffy 18B2 or whatever. The Lefebvre? Cafefe? No, wait, what? Churchill is on fire, the artillery is on low health, we're probably not going to get over there in time to do anything, and you can see here we're trundling along at a respectable speed, 40, sort of 8-ish kilometers an hour on the level. That's a bit of a dicey shot, but nuts to it. And we, whoa, IKV, you done goofed right at the end, it's a good thing we don't need you, and that is the match. So there we go. Nice quick game there at Tier 5 to show you. Let's have a look at the results. Here we go then, the results of that first game. First class mastery, fire for effect, and bruiser. Didn't feel like a particularly spectacular game, but that howitzer does manage to rack up the damage. 1,311 damage, 3 kills, 881 base experience, which puts us on the top of our team by XP and second by damage. Shout out to that leopard who managed to wreck face as well. Yeah, not really that much more to say about it. 15 shots fired, 9 hits, 9 penetrations, for that damage count, 2 hits received, received, both of them penetrated. 1 enemy vehicle spotted, 8 enemy vehicles damaged, 3 of them destroyed, a little bit of assistance damage, and even with a standard account, yes, we missed some shots, but those HE shells are not expensive, so that was a 16,000 credit profit for a 4.5 minute match with a standard account. Let's move on to another game. As promised then, here is your Tier 7 match. We're here on Lakeville. Not exactly my favourite map in the game, but whatever, it will do. So, we have got an IS on each team, we got a Tiger, they got a Panther, we got a Challenger, they got an SU-152. We'll see how this goes. Still using the derp gun, of course, haven't changed out. And this is the nice thing with the derp gun, even in a Tier 7 match, you don't bother aiming really, you just derp people in the face and run away. Doing your best Zoidberg impression. So, having a look at how the team is splitting, we've got the standard carousel of people going to the valley to be useless and probably die. Fantastic. KV-1S, myself, IKV, Stridsvang, and the IS, oh, and to be fair, the Tiger, all appear to be heading in a Citywood direction, which is vaguely encouraging. So that means hopefully we should be able to get some crossfire going up over the lake between ourselves and the guys on the road. Enemy Leopard has been spotted out, but he doesn't last very long, although we lose our Leopard for our trouble, but he did go down the Valley of Death, so whatever. This is an encounter match, of course, so the Valley is even more useless than it usually is. OI Experimental has been reduced to 123 health already. I don't think he was particularly cautious getting into the town. Oh dear. So we'll see if we can finish him off unless the IKV beats us to it. And it should be pointed out that when I played... Never mind, he's dead. I was going to say when I played this replay, I'm pretty sure it was before they changed the OI Experimental, so it still has the 10cm gun, which would still shave off 2/3 of my health with one shot, so we do need to be careful about that. However, pushing forwards, and you can take some risks when you're bottom tier. I mean, your tank isn't that valuable at the end of the day. We managed to bounce the T-34. We don't do any damage ourselves, but, you know, whatever. He bounces on us. There you go. You can see the armour does occasionally do something. Skoda T-25 doesn't bounce, but we did bounce the shot from the T-34. And we ended up trading the Skodas. 124 for 133 from us. Another 145 into his face. This time he doesn't get the shot back, and this is just how you end up playing the tank. You trade, and of course we get some tracking damage because high explosive shells ripped his tracks off, and oh, we're in a bad place. We're in a very bad place. Oh dear. Right, there's a Panther there. KV-85 just blatted me in the face, so I need to pull around that corner. I can't take the KV-85 again, and thankfully the Panther has been encouraged to run away. Really didn't want to run into a KV-85 there. I guess kind of a good thing that he was using the smaller guns, so we didn't immediately die. Although that did mean he was more accurate, I guess. Taking a shot at the SU-100, and HE shell penetrates the side of the SU-100, and a high damage roll, 446, and we execute him. Gotta love those HE shells. KV-85 is still here, still being a bit of a nuisance, but we've now got some friends. Put one into his tracks. Primarily we just want the guy to stay there because then we're going to pick up assistance damage, and then that stops the guy turning around and killing us. So I'm happy just to keep blatting away at his tracks. And there we go. He is dead. Scoreline is 10-4, so this hasn't been a particularly slow game, sorry. M4 Sherman up ahead and the Panther, but fear the mighty derp, we come to claim you all. Oh, M4 Sherman's dead. Artillery hits the Tiger, though thankfully we don't get caught in the splash. Panther is dead, and that just leaves the IS, SU-152, and the SU-8 artillery. It's the camping Soviets. Fantastic. All of them have now been spotted over in that bottom left-hand corner of the map. So we're just going to work our way round and see if we can do some damage to them. Challenger takes out the IS. That's not a sentence you hear too often. And we are taking aim at the SU-8 artillery, who just took a hit, and that ends up killing him for our second kill. SU-152 is the only guy still standing then. Hopefully we should be able to put at least one shot into him. That would be nice. It'd be really nice if we could get some assistance damage into the bargain, but you never know. We might be lucky, we might not. There he is. He's looking at me. I don't have Sixth Sense on this crew. 106 into his face. We may not be able to do much more before he dies. There we go, he's a corpse and the game is over. So, once again, let's go and have a look at these post-battle stats. So, that was enough on Lakeville for second class mastery, fire for effect, and bruiser medals. Bruiser is an award you pick up quite a lot because of all that lovely module damage from those lovely HE shells. So we finished with 1,207 damage done, 2 enemy kills, 735 base XP. We didn't finish at the top by damage done, but we were one of the top damage dealers. In fact, across both teams, it was only the enemy Su-152 and the friendly Stilitzwang and Challenger who did more damage than we did. That damage, of course, was helped very much by the penetrating shot on the side of the Su-100. And you could argue and say, oh, but you were lucky, you can't expect that every game. And while that is true, you also have to bear in mind that if you'd taken the other gun, you wouldn't get that ever. You know, you can't penetrate and do 440 damage when your maximum damage is 115 plus or minus 25%. So, by taking the howitzer, you at least open up the possibility to get those amusing shots. 9 shots fired, 8 hits, 8 pens, 1,207 damage done, as I said, 564 from more than 300 meters. Most of the shots were from close range. 4 hits received, 2 penetrations, 2 did not, so you do get the occasional bounce. 170 damage blocked by our armour, 3 enemy vehicles spotted, 6 damage, 2 destroyed, 317 assistance damage, and less than 5-minute match, and once again with a standard account that was a 14,000 credit profit. Once again, tier 5 machines tend to be fairly profitable. With a premium account that would have been a 23,000 credit profit, so you can see how that money can start to rack up, even in a tank that you haven't physically spent a penny on. So, that was the gameplay I wanted to show you. Let's just round things off in the garage. So, verdict time. What do I think of the M4 Sherman? It's a very good machine. I think it's an excellent little machine for driving around at tier 5, having some fun, blatting some people in the face. Am I keeping it? No, but that may seem like a slightly odd comment, given that I just said it was very good. Yes. However, as I mentioned earlier on, there are effectively 2 tier 5 Shermans in the game. You have the British Sherman 3 as well. And for me, I have more spare British crews lying around than I do spare American crews. So if I keep a crew for the M4 Sherman, I'm going to have to train up another American crew for another tank. If I keep the Sherman 3, the crew I had to quote-unquote train up to replace that crew was already relatively not terrible, if that makes sense. So it makes more sense for me, in my particular situation, given the 2 tanks are so similar, it makes more sense for me to keep the Sherman 3 than it does to keep the M4 Sherman, if you see what I mean. Nonetheless, I think it is a very good tank. Whichever variety of Sherman you decide to play and decide to keep, they are both very good, and I do thoroughly recommend them. I could argue maybe they're a little too good, although I think a lot of that is probably due to the fact that I'm a fairly experienced player, playing at tier 5. Yeah, make of that what you will. So, for my money, I definitely think the Sherman is a keeper, but I'm actually keeping the other Sherman. So, that's all. Anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed that review. I found it vaguely informative. I thought it was definitely worth doing a review of one of the most iconic tanks in military history. If you did enjoy it, by all means, feel free to catch some of my other videos and or subscribe to my channel, and I wish you very happy hunting on that battlefield. Ciao, ciao.